what I thought I'd do, and please bear in mind, when we talk about clusters here, what I think we're talking about are clusters of cancer or other chronic diseases, not infectious disease, which gets treated very differently. So I want to have that preface. And what I thought I'd do is just kind of go through a couple of different perspectives. One, I think, from a straight epidemiologist perspective, and the other from a public health practitioner. And certainly, again, over the years, many clusters have been brought to my attention, and we have followed up or we have investigated, and those have involved both clusters reported from community members and clusters reported in workplaces. So, are they rare? No, they occur relatively frequently. Should we try to identify them proactively? I mean, should we encourage cluster reporting? Should we respond to them? Should we ignore them? And are they likely to teach us anything of scientific or public health value? And now with GIS, Geographic Information Systems, and lots of other tools, should we be mapping clusters in a more routine manner, or should we be doing kind of routine small area analysis of health statistics, looking for aberrations from provincial or other norms? And some people have suggested that as well. So hopefully I'll answer all of those questions through the presentation. So first, a definition. This comes from Rothman, who's an excellent and well-recognized epidemiologist. So he gives the sort of Oxford English Dictionary definition. So just a number of persons, animals, or things gathered or situated close together. So, that sounds pretty common. Rothman observes that, clusters have been around as long as diseases have, and that although this definition implies clustering in space, that if we think about clustering in a more scientific view, we should be looking at clustering in time by demographics like age, sex, any kind of a risk factor, and so forth. So, I mean, that gets into modern epidemiology, where we do studies on groups of workers who may have similar exposures, and we've learned an incredible amount that way. But that's a little different than cluster investigation. So, Rothman goes on to say that, virtually every disease, infectious or not, exhibits clustering, and that finding a cluster of disease is not surprising. Rates are always going to be higher in some places than others, and indeed, if you do a plot across Ontario of, what are the rates of any particular cancer, you don't find an absolute uniform rate across Ontario by LIN, Local Health Integration Network, or by health unit. There are variations, and many of those are just random over time and place. So you don't get an absolutely homogeneous set of rates. Temporal clustering, we know, occurs with things like infectious disease, motor vehicle accidents, and things like hay fever, which are very seasonal. We do some epidemiologic studies at Public Health Ontario in my group, and we certainly have to adjust for many seasonal factors in some of the outcomes that we look at when we're trying to make links to exposures like air pollution in the community. So, rates are sometimes temporarily elevated. So, a workplace example would be where you might have, in the old days, chloracne due to chlorinated solvent exposure, or things like chickenpox that occur in clusters. So, Rothman is a skeptic on the utility of investigating clusters for these reasons. And he points out that the clusters that come forward are usually too small to allow useful epidemiologic study, and that these clusters are often based on vague definitions, too heterogeneous for useful study. I think there are ways around that. Cluster is often defined by the Texas sharpshooter phenomenon, and it's difficult to define the population base for formal statistical analysis. So everyone's familiar with the Texas sharpshooter, are you? Yeah, so that's the person who shoots a hole in the side of the barn and then goes and draws the target around his bullet hole. So that's one way of looking like a really good shot, but the problem is the bullet came first, then the target, and that becomes a bit of a challenge in some cluster investigation as well, because we know, oh, there are people here who are on the same street or the same workplace with cancer. Yeah, okay, and then to try and do statistical testing after the fact is not really going to give you the same kind of results as if you've got a prospectively designed epidemiologic study. The other challenges are that the exposures are often poorly characterized, and clusters often generate a lot of publicity, and then it makes it very difficult once that publicity has occurred to go back and ask questions about exposure or other risk factors that you're interested in. So, Rothman is I think, quite a skeptic there. Are they worth investigating? Well, the site's 61 NIOSH investigations, only 16 confirmed an excess of cancer, and there was little or no causal insight from these investigations, and that cluster investigations detract or take away resources from more productive epidemiologic evaluation of toxic substances in the environment. So that's kind of the critical side of why we shouldn't do cluster investigation. Little scientific or public health purpose, little reason to study overall for, learning more about patterns of disease in space and time, and therefore he is of the opinion that we don't need to develop new statistical techniques to better investigate clusters. So there's a little bit of a counterpoint here from another very esteemed individual, Ray Neutra, who worked with the California Department of Health Services. So he had a job probably more like mine. So as someone with training in epidemiology, as I have, he agrees with Rothman's perspective, and I certainly can't disagree with Dr. Rothman, many of Dr. Rothman's points, but he points out that, well, this is public health practice that we're doing here at the California Department of Health Services, and when you get a report of a cluster from a workplace or from a community, it's not a matter of is there scientifically meritorious investigation that can be done. It's a matter of really dealing with people who have, I think, very real questions, very real concerns that need to be addressed, and that, prompt service can often succeed. So, my approach to clusters when health units call is, I think when you get a complaint of a cluster, it's very legitimate to take heed of it, to ask more questions, to follow up and investigate, because I think that's an expectation of folks in communities, of their health units. So, the questions that we usually get, I've got 5 people on my street with cancer. I've never known that many people on my street having cancer before. So, for that neighborhood, it's something brand new. And you can understand that that provokes concerns, questions about what's going on. Is there something in common between all these cancers? So, the other question is there that cause, and is it still operating, and what can you, either public health or occupational health and safety, do to assure us that there isn't something we're still being exposed to that is placing us at risk? Very legitimate questions, I think. He admits that there is a problem with exposure data, but I think you can take a look, you can do questionnaires, you can certainly ask people, I think more importantly, what do you think it may be due to? And certainly our more on the community side now, follow-ups, we often get concerns about all these students in that one school, is there something in that school that's behind this cluster of cancers in adolescents or people who have recently graduated from that school? That particular facility in my neighborhood where I see a lot of smoke coming out the stack, is that behind this particular cluster? So usually if you take a bit more of a history, you can find that there is a particular underlying concern that folks have as to whether there's a linkage there. So you certainly move ahead at your peril. I think you have to be epidemiologically astute. I think you have to be sensitive to picking up concerns and how to respond to folks who may be very sure that there's something going on. Statistical comparisons, even Neutra points out that, if you start doing multiple statistical tests on data that, if you look for 80 cancers around a single point source, you got better than a 50% chance that one of them is going to be elevated p less than 0.01. So again, the problems of using statistics in kind of what we often used to call a data dredging or a data fishing kind of expedition. It's not the same as applying a statistical test after the fact to data that you've collected to test a hypothesis. And he points out that in the entire literature, as far as he can tell, only one new carcinogen has been turned up, aragonite, which you probably remember the story in Turkey about villagers and mesothelioma there, and one new carcinogen being turned up. So cancer clusters in the USA, so there's a systematic review of sort of community or public health cancer cluster investigations, and the results here again were pretty discouraging. So increased incidence, so of these investigations, only 72 or 13% confirmed that there was an elevated incidence in the cancer. And I mean, we've certainly had cancer clusters here in Ontario where we get to the point where we confirm that people know what they're talking about. Cancer really is elevated. But only 3 of these were linked to hypothesized exposure, and only 1 revealed the true cause. And I think that was actually mesothelioma and asbestos, which again was hardly a new finding. So the conclusion of this systematic review is, as you see, if the goal is to enhance our understanding of disease causes and reduce the number of cancers based on the results of this review, it's unlikely that we're really turning up anything that allows us to move ahead with health protection and improving public health or worker health and safety. So what's worth doing? Well, I think responding to clusters as a public health action or workplace health and safety action is worth doing. Not because I think we're going to turn up new knowledge, new evidence, but I think we do have people who have very real concerns, very real questions, and I think those people do deserve a response and an answer to their questions. So that's a bit of an ethical perspective there. I think first step that we follow is we try to assess or ascertain all the cases. So case verification, we can do some tests looking at, is this really an elevation compared to provincial or regional rates that we'd expect? And as I say, we have found some clusters which people are correct. There is a genuine excess of a particular type of cancer in a particular area of the province over a particular period of time. However, going beyond that and then investigating exposures, which we think is, again, a very important thing. So asking folks, so, is there anything you think is behind it? Is there anything you're particularly concerned about? When we have gone and done that additional step of trying to identify a common exposure, we have yet to find any of these clusters that we could link to a common cause or any kind of a common exposure. And helping us in this is certainly asking people what they are concerned about, whether it's a water system, whether it's an air pollution source, whether it's a particular workplace exposure. IARC, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, in the last few years has developed a sort of a cancer site listing of the IARC carcinogens, and you can take a look at lung cancer. What are the environmental occupational causes that are linked to that? You can look at pancreatic cancer, you can look at lymphomas. So we now have, I think, a very nice tool that if there is a genuine cluster of a particular type of cancer, you can very quickly take a look at what are the established risk factors. And in our investigations, we encourage health units, because health units are the frontline support, to take a look at, is there any evidence that any of those carcinogens are present in excess or would result in elevated exposures to people in a particular neighborhood or group. So, if you do find something, there's always the opportunity of ongoing monitoring, future research, epidemiology, but in my experience, failed to identify any cluster with a common cause. We have identified true clusters, and I think by and large, responding to those clusters and giving people answers to their questions is a worthwhile public health activity. So what we should do, I think, instead is improve our surveillance. And I think for what we really need to do in public health and occupational health and safety is probably improve our exposure surveillance. So not be, investigating clusters of outcomes as much as taking a look at what are trends in exposures. Are exposures higher some places than others? Is there something there that we need to get more worried about and investigate? And of course, we've got the sort of progress of, is something a hazard? Is it present in the environment? Is there a route of exposure? Are people exposed? Is there a target? Then it gets into people, so it reaches the target tissue, causes an adverse event, whether it's cancer or some other health outcome. And what we do a pretty good job of, we've got pretty good, data on health outcomes in Ontario. The Institute for Clinical Evaluative Sciences is a treasure trove of health outcome data. What we don't do a particularly good job of is exposure surveillance. And I think that's very, very true in workplaces and for many aspects of community exposures, as we found in our recent report on environmental burden of cancer in Ontario, done with Cancer Care Ontario. We found some quite significant gaps or lacks in some of the exposure data we were looking for communities as well. So I think putting our resources and time into that more proactively upstage is more worthwhile. So thank you, and questions. And